So, look, I'd like to keep this very informal. I thought it was a very good segue to get to this point, particularly hearing the PEC's point of view. So my goal really is to give you a picture of what is high-performing teams, to demystify it, and talk about what are some of the next steps on the journey that Andy talked about. So very quickly, let me just get to this point. A lot of what was set up here is the case in many organizations. We work in a variety of sectors around the world. And when you look at some of these points, you hear this all the time. I would tell you that I've been in this field now for, a long time, 35 years as a consultant. And the fact of the matter is that I've never seen a time in my life where there's as much competitive pressure, and companies feel it. So even if companies are doing very well, they still feel like they have their devil on their tail to keep sustaining it. And if they're not doing well, it's like, how do they quickly turn around? You don't see many companies today in cruise control. So the idea of trying to eliminate silos, the teaming that people spoke of, is not a luxury anymore. It really is that you'd have to work as a high-performing team just to be in the game. So the logic of a high-performing team is that ultimately you can speed up decision-making, speed up design-to-market time, decrease levels of supervision, allow senior executives to become more strategic. There's a host of benefits. But the point here is that in many cases it's counterintuitive. So when you look at an organization, when we go into organizations and work, nobody ever says to us that we're like everybody else. The common refrain in every company, no matter where you go, is that we're unique. And they're right in the sense that the milieu is unique, the culture may be different, but underneath it all, it's always the same stuff. So when you think of the term alignment, like aligning your automobile, aligning your back at a chiropractor, when you talk about aligning a company, these are the 5 factors that have to be in place. What tends to happen, though, is that most companies tend to spend their energy focusing on the strategy and the business priorities because it's easier to see. It's very black and white. The area of protocols is an interesting one, and let me just explain what that means. Those aren't value statements. That would be things like when decision-making occurs, when would it be a consultative call? When would it be unilateral? When would it be consensus? When conflicts emerge, how do we escalate? How do we force closure? When communications occurs, who's in the loop, who's not? So this literally is the brass tacks of how does an organization work. In the absence of having explicit protocols, what tends to happen inadvertently is people come in from different companies, like immigrants coming from foreign lands, and they try to really immediately put in their best practices. But the problem then is that you have no common language. So the logic here is to have a commonality so that people have a picture of this is what it looks like when the organization is working functionally rather than not. So the point is that going into Novartis or going into any company, we know one way or the other, you have to get closure here. But the logic is that you're trying to create what you would call a high-performing team. If you're paid to have an impact in the company, then just by definition, you're going to have to challenge the status quo. But when you challenge the status quo, you are many times going to be ruffling feathers of people who created it before you got there. So the question is, can you challenge? Can you press into issues? Can you have difficult conversations and still preserve the business relationship? That's the key. One thing I would say to you is that if you asked most people, if you solicited input from our clients or companies that have gone down this road, what they would usually tell you is the most difficult aspect to work in a high-performing, horizontal team environment would be trying to have peers hold peers accountable. That's the counterintuitive part. So just going back to Andy's point before around, let's say in the pre-alignment, people would go to you with an expectation you'd handle it like dad. Post-alignment is like they own that. But again, for a lot of folks, that may be not the easiest thing to do because in many cases you want to preserve relationships. In trying to go from a hierarchy to a horizontal, the first stage, testing, is when there are issues there, but you don't have the conversations. So the organization is kind of colluding to stay in the closet, to stay underground with what the issues are. Stage 2 is when you put the issues on the table, but there could be some tension in the air. Stage 3 is when you set up a new game. This is where you're clarifying accountabilities, ways of working, interdependencies, etc. And then finally, stage 4 is the high-performing team. So again, going back to the point of it being journey, it's not like I worked with the PEC and then they got a certificate at the end of 2 days saying you're now a high-performing team. I mean, that's not real life. What you can do, though, is you can accelerate the game very dramatically. So what I would say to you is that as we start this process with this group, the key to the game ultimately is going to be, what will it take for people to feel? In fact, let me just preface this. A couple of years ago, I was on this TV show in Connecticut. And I remember this reporter was asking me questions about some book I had put out, and they said, what's the toughest issue that any consultant ever faces? Or what's the toughest issue you ever faced? And in my mind, it's like, I didn't want, it was like one of those, I don't know what to say about that. So I said to the person, which I'm glad, I thought it was a good response, I said, look, there isn't a specific business issue. It's really around the issue of how long does it take for the real issue to get on the table. That, to me, is the core issue. So when you think about the greatest level of dysfunctionality in an organization, it's not stage 2. That's when it's contentious. Stage 1 is when people start to check out. So what I would say to you is that if there is a way to really dramatically accelerate the ability for this team, this group of 140, to work as a high-performing team, it's going to be people finding a way to feel like it's safe for them to put issues on the table. That's really the first battle to go through this.